build your warehouse, grow your resources and wealth in your little village somewhere between the high mountain ranges of Bolivia and Peru. Do you want to learn how to play Altiplano?
In this video, we're going to take you through the full rules of the game, and if you stay tuned till the end, hopefully you can pick up some tips and strategies along the way. Coming up. Hi, it's Tarrant.
And Stella from Meeple University, bringing you a variety of quality board game videos. On this channel we do a lot of overview, review, playthrough, vlog, and how to play just like this one.
So, if you're new here, please consider subscribing and do hit the bell to be notified of when we post new videos.
Now let's get to the rules of Altiplano, designed by Rainier Stockhausen and published by DLP Games.
Altiplano is a pool building game set in this South American high country. Players will move around through these 7 locations, trading for and gaining various resources, cards, and building the road in order to build up their particular wealth. Through the game, players will have a pool building economy. They will gather resource tokens into a bag, from which they will blindly draw into their planning spaces. They will use those to plan their various actions from their player board, and then discard them into a container. Once their bags are empty, the container is recycled into the bag and cycles through. At the end of the game, players will gain victory points for all of the resources they've collected through their bag and container, as well as ones that they've moved into their warehouse, and some additional bonuses for houses, canoes, or contracts that they may have fulfilled. There are a number of pathways to victory, and the player with the most victory points will win the game. Setup in Altiplano is highly customized depending on your player count. To start, in all player counts, you will lay out the 7 location tiles in a circle, but in any configuration you'd like. It's important that you can tell which tiles are adjacent to each other in this setup. Then you'll place a number of tiles, cards, or tokens onto these various spaces on the location tiles depending on your player count. So the farm will take alpacas, wool and cloth. The village will take the carts and all of the house cards, which can be placed face up. The forest takes cocoa and wood. The market takes glass and order cards, which again are placed face up. The mountain contains stone, ore and silver. The harbour contains fish and canoe cards, again placing them face up. And the road contains corn, and each player places one of his or her cubes on the top space of the road track, indicated by the arrow or the number 4. Any leftover tokens or cubes for your player count go back into the box. You will not use them during the game. For the rest of the video, I'm just going to show shorter stacks, so they're a little easier to work with. Somewhere near the market location tile, place the extension strip. Then you'll set up the extension deck. Remove any tiles that do not correspond to your player count by looking at the bottom right corner of the tile. Then divide all of the tiles into different piles based on the letter on their back. You should have A's, B's, C's and D's. Shuffle each separately and then create a pile with the A's atop the B's, atop the C's, atop the D's, and put them near this strip. Deal out the top 5 of these into the extension strip like so. The money and food tokens can go into the middle of the circle. Each player takes a cloth bag, a player board, a warehouse board, and then a meeple and container in his or her colour. Each player then takes one of the cart cubes from the village tile and places it here onto the top cart. Each player then takes one of the 7 roll tiles. You can draft these or you can deal them out randomly. The player should place this next to his or her player board somewhere near the corresponding black and white icon. The player then takes his or her starting resources based on what's printed at the bottom of the roll tile. Here the player would take a food, a stone, an alpaca, and 2 coins. Remember again, these come from the stacks that you've put on the main board, not any of the ones you put aside after setup. Money is placed next to your player board, and any circular tiles go into your cloth bag. Choose a first player who gets the 3D alpaca token, and you're now ready to play. Each round of Altiplano is played in 4 phases: drawing, planning, actions, and then preparation for the next round. I'm going to give you a brief overview now of that general turn flow before coming back and going through each of those phases in more detail. To start a typical draw phase, the player will look at his or her current position on the road track, then randomly draw that many tiles from his or her bag, placing them onto the planning spaces like so. If the player's bag runs out of pieces while doing this, he or she will empty all chips from the container back into the bag and keep drawing. All players draw simultaneously. Then follows the planning phase, in which players will move tokens from their planning spaces onto their action spaces. This will program in advance which actions the players plan to take during that round. Once again, all players will perform their planning phases simultaneously. Then comes the actions phase. Starting with the player with the first player token and going clockwise around the table from there, players will take it in turns to take one action. Each player may also move before or after his or her action. Taking an action has 2 prerequisites. The player's Meeple must be at the location tile which matches the action the player wishes to take, based on these icons. And secondly, the player must have placed the tokens required to perform the action onto the relevant action spaces during the planning phase. Thus, this player in this location could spend 1 alpaca, discarding it to his or her discard container, in order to gain 1 wool, which is gained into the player's discard container. Most actions will take this form. They'll involve a player discarding into the container to gain either new tokens into the container, or maybe to gain some cards or other bonuses. Some actions instead require the player to pay money, which goes back to the general supply rather than the container, in order to gain something from the board. Because the player needs to be in a specific location to take that action, movement becomes a critical part of the actions phase. And players have limited movement based on how many carts they've purchased and how much food they've planned into these spaces. After a player has completed a single action, as well as any optional movements, play passes to the next player who completes 1 action, and so on around the table. Once a player no longer wishes to perform an action on his or her turn, he or she passes and is out of the round. Play then continues among the other players until all players have passed. Then you'll complete a brief cleanup phase getting ready for the next round, including handing the first player marker clockwise around the table and resetting a couple of features on the board. Continue playing rounds in this manner until the end of the game is triggered. I'll go more into what the endgame triggers are later on in the video. Complete 1 more round after the end of the game is triggered, and then proceed to final scoring. So now let's look through each of these steps again in more detail, starting with the drawing phase. At the start of the drawing phase, you'll check the road tile to see where your cube is located and how many planning spaces you can use. In this case here, yellow could use 4, blue and black could both use 5, and red could use 6. The most planning spaces possibly available is 8. Normally, you're going to go straight into your bag and draw that many tiles and put them onto your planning spaces, but there are a couple of decisions you can make first. Firstly, you may have some tiles left over in your planning spaces from the previous round. This would be if you'd drawn tiles and chosen not to put them up onto the top of the board. If you have tiles like this, you simply leave them there and they will occupy one of your planning spaces. Secondly, you may still have some tiles in some of your action spaces from putting them up there in previous rounds but not yet doing the actions. If you have any tiles like this but you want to move them somewhere else, before drawing from your bag, you can take 1 or more of those tiles back and put them into planning spaces. This is the only way to get a tile off an action space without actually performing the action. Only then, once you've made those decisions, do you start drawing tiles from your bag and placing them onto the action spaces. If your bag runs out of tiles while doing this, take your discard container, empty it into your bag, and then continue drawing until you have reached the number of action spaces that you have available. This means that your position on the road is the number of spaces that you use, not the number of tiles you draw. If you have any there or bring any back, they will use up one of your action spaces and reduce your draw. You may also choose not to draw your full complement of tiles, but there are only a couple of very specific circumstances in which you'd want to do that. The second phase of each round is the planning phase, and this is where players will move tokens from the planning spaces to the action spaces on their board, their starting roll tile, and any extensions that they've purchased during the game. Players will be attempting to place these into the locations corresponding to the actions that they want to take. There are two main restrictions when doing this. Firstly, any tokens that are left on spaces from previous rounds cannot be moved. And as such, it's a good idea if you're trying out a few combinations to keep the tiles that you're newly placing offset from the full space until you've made your total decision. Secondly, tokens can only go onto a space where there is a valid action to carry out with that token. Some spaces, particularly on extensions but also down at the road or on the wagons, have a specific type of token printed there, and so only that type of token can be placed. A location like the farm has 3 possible actions you can take, and we'll go through these later, but what's shown on the left are the tokens that you need to take those actions. And therefore only those sorts of tokens can go onto those spaces, even though the spaces are showing blank. As such, the player could put food and wool up here, but would not be able to place the wood. Note that the village and the market both have actions which allow any type of token to be placed, and so you could put that there even though it doesn't specifically show a wood icon. Once you have worked out your combination of actions that you want to take, or the combination of actions that you want to set up for future rounds, then move all of your tokens in and lock in your planning phase. This sets the only actions that you'll be able to take in this round, as well as on this track in the middle, it plans the amount of movement that you'll be able to do. We'll see this again later, but each player gets 1 movement for free per round, and then requires 1 food for each additional movement beyond that. One tricky feature of the planning phase is extension tiles which have a monetary cost instead of a token cost. On the main board at the village and the market, you will see some actions that cost money. You do not need to plan for these actions. You can simply be in the location and then spend money from your pool. However, an extension tile which shows a money cost with this larger money icon requires planning. And in order to use this action during your turn, you must place the 2 money onto this space during the planning phase. This has a couple of implications. Firstly, it means you won't be able to use a money extension tile on the turn you acquire it. Secondly, it means you won't be able to spend money that you don't have at the start of your turn on one of these extension tiles. And it means you won't have this planned money for other money actions on your turn. The same is not true for the basic village and market actions where you are simply spending money from your pool and don't have to plan ahead for it. Finally, when doing your planning phase, remember that it is not mandatory to move all of the tiles off your planning spaces. And so the player could hold this wood back, for example, in order to use it on this space again on the future round when these locations become available again. But you cannot discard this tile outright without using it in an action. Although all players do their planning simultaneously, players will declare their planning phase finished in turn order. In other words, the player with the first player token has to declare planning finished first, giving all other players the opportunity to respond to his or her plans. You'll find that there's only a small minority of actions in the game where turn order is important, and so this often isn't going to have a big impact on the game, but there are some opportunities where you would want to respond to what players before you in turn order are doing, and this gives you the opportunity. After all players have completed planning, proceed to the actions phase. In the actions phase, players will take it in turns, starting with the player with the first player marker and going clockwise around the board, taking one action at a time. Taking an action requires tokens to have been planned onto the action spaces corresponding to that action, and requires the player's Meeple to be at the location matching that action. To accommodate this, prior to or after each action a player takes, the player may optionally move around the board. Players choose their starting location for the very first round of the game, but in all subsequent rounds will start where they ended at the end of the previous round. The rules governing movement in the game tend to be one of the trickier features of the game which trips up new players, as there are restrictions on the total number of times you can move in a round and the distance you can move. To start the game, each player has one cart in this top slot, and this represents one free movement per round. At any point during the player's turn, he or she may spend that cart in order to move a distance between 1 and 3 spaces. Because this is a 7-space board, that essentially means to move anywhere on the board. Any subsequent move that a player wishes to take during that round requires the player to spend 1 food from one of these pre-planned travel spaces. The distance covered by this additional move depends on whether the player has built a cart into that slot or not. Spending a food from a slot without a cart allows the player only to travel on foot 1 space. If you spend a food with a cart, then, like your starting cart, you're able to move any distance. So that movement would allow the player to move to any other space on the board. Building additional carts is fine for getting extra distance, but unless you load those spaces up with food, you will not be able to use that cart. As such, playing food into these spaces gives you more flexibility to take actions on more spaces on the board at once, and buying carts gives you the flexibility to take a lot of actions that are quite distant from each other. You can take your actions and movements in whatever order you wish. So if the blue player had the right tokens on the board, he or she could take actions at the harbour, then spend this food to go and take actions at the mountain, then spend the free cart to go and take actions elsewhere, thereby saving the food associated with the cart for a future round. So, now that we understand how to move around the board to the different locations, let's look at all of the basic actions of the game in detail. Through this section, I'm often going to show the location tile next to the player board so you can see all of the relevant information in one go. The most basic sorts of actions in the game are a straight swap of resources for other resources. When this happens, the player takes the resources from his or her board and puts them into the container, and then gains the new resources and puts them in the container as well. So at the farm, the player could spend 1 alpaca to gain 1 food. Within the same type of action, the player could spend 2 alpacas at once to gain 2 food. The player could spend an alpaca and a food to gain a wool, or could spend a wool and a food in order to gain a cloth. Note that on the farm board and all other boards, you'll see a sun showing a number of points, and this is the number of victory points that you'll get for each of these tokens that you have in your circulation or warehouse at the end of the game. At the mountains, the player can spend 2 food in order to get 1 stone, or can spend an ore and a food in order to get 1 silver. At the forest, the player can spend 2 food in order to take 1 wood, or could spend a cocoa in order to take a food, a cloth, or a glass. You'll note that some of these resources that you're collecting aren't from the forest tile. They'll come from whichever tile they're normally placed on. Once again, here you could spend 2 cocoa at once in order to take any 2 matching or non-matching of those benefits. At the harbour, the player can spend a fish and a food in order to gain another food. The player could spend 2 fish in order to gain a stone, or can spend 2 wood in order to build a canoe. To do this, the player takes the full stack of canoe cards and looks through them to pick the one of his or her choice. All the rest go back into the pile. The canoe card will grant the player 2 points at the end of the game, and he or she immediately gets a once-off benefit of 1 token based on what's printed on the card. There is 1 canoe corresponding to each of the basic resources in the game. Players always have full choice from the range of canoes left and can always look through the pack. Whichever canoe happens to be on top is just a consequence of how you've placed the deck. At the road, only a single action is available. By spending a wood and a stone, the player can contribute to building the road by moving his or her cube 1 space down the road track. If the player's cube reaches a space showing a number, then this will unlock another planning space in all subsequent rounds. If the player's cube reaches a space showing corn, then the player takes a corn token from the stack and puts it into his or her warehouse, not into the container. It's a square token, so you should be able to remember that. I'll come back and talk about the rules regarding placement in the warehouse later on. There are a wide range of actions available at the market. The first 4 all involve selling goods for money. For a single action, the player may take as many tokens as desired from these planning spaces, put them in the container, and then gain the amount of money based on what those resources were. Alpacas and wool are both worth 1 coin, as are stone and ore. Cloth is worth 2 coins, and silver is worth 3. Money the players gain in these actions goes straight into the player's pool and can be spent on other money actions from the main board. The next action allows the player to spend money from his or her pool to buy an extension strip from the market. The player does not have to spend any resources to do this, simply has to pay money from his or her pool back to the supplier. The cost to buy an extension is the cost shown in the top left corner of that extension, which will be 1 or 2, plus the amount shown for its position on the extension strip, which will be 0 at the bottom of the board up to a total of 4 at the top. The player pays the money for the extension of his or her choice, takes that extension and places it next to the corresponding location on his or her player board. All of the leftover extensions stay where they are, they don't slide until the end of the round. There are 2 very important restrictions on the purchasing of extensions. Firstly, regardless of how much money a player has, no player may buy more than 1 extension per round. Secondly, a player may never buy 2 identical extensions, so this player could not buy this. This rule also counts the player's starting roll card, so the player who had this particular roll would not be able to purchase this extension because its action is identical. The next option at the market is to purchase an order. To do this, the player spends 1 coin and then looks through the order pack to find an order of his or her preference. The order provides a set of 2 or 3 resources that the player needs to deliver to a foreign party in order to gain a number of victory points. A player may not have more than 1 incomplete order at any given time, so until the player has completed this order, he or she cannot take that action again. The final action available at the market is to deliver goods to an order. When doing this action, the player may take 1 or more tokens from action spaces and then place them onto his or her incomplete order card. This action is the only way for players to complete their orders. Once tokens are on an order card, they are out of the player's circulation for the rest of the game. They'll never go back in the container nor in the player's bag. Once a player has completely finished an order, then he or she will score the number of victory points shown on that order at the end of the game, as well as immediately taking a corn token from the road. And as before, this goes straight into the player's warehouse, which I'll talk about shortly. Now that this is complete, the player may purchase another order again if he or she wishes. The last of the 7 locations is the village, and there are 3 actions available here. The first action is to purchase a cart, and to do this the player takes $1 from his or her pool and spends that to take a cart from the supply. This is then placed onto any one of the cart spaces that the player likes on his or her player board. The player may start using this cart immediately. A player may purchase at most 1 cart per round of the game and can have no more than 4 at any given time. The second action available is to spend 2 stone in order to build a house. As for all of the other cards, the player looks through the full deck of houses available, chooses the one of his or her preference, and then takes it into his or her player area. A house will be worth 4 points at the end of the game, and it'll be worth 1 extra point for a specific type of resource. In other words, in this case, the player would gain 1 extra point for every cloth token that he or she has collected through the game. There is 1 house card available for each of the basic resources in the game. The final action available at the village is to move any number of resources from these planting spaces into the player's warehouse. Once tokens have been moved into the warehouse, they are permanently out of the player's circulation. That is, they'll no longer be discarded and they'll no longer go into the player's bag. But each token will still be worth victory points at the end of the game, and rows in the warehouse that are completely filled will be worth additional points. So, filling up your warehouse, in addition to these points, is a critical way of keeping your supply of circulating tokens low, so that you can target the actions and the token types that really help you the most. So, let's look at placement rules in the warehouse. Firstly, you can never place food into your warehouse. Next, you're going to start filling rows in your warehouse in number order. So you'll start with row 1 in the bottom left and finish with row 11 up here in the top right. Once you start a row in the warehouse, that defines the type of goods which must completely fill that row. So from this point on, only silver could be placed in this bottom left row. However, you do not need to completely fill a row before moving to the next row with a different type of goods. So the player could start a row with cocoa here, and then in the next action start a row with fish, and fill up the fish. However, the player could not start a row of the same type of goods before filling a previous one, which is with that type of goods. Special rules apply to corn. Remember that, as we've mentioned earlier in the video, as soon as you take a corn token, you must immediately place it into your warehouse. For the purposes of filling up rows, corn counts as wild, and so a row that contains cocoa, for example, could be filled up with corn. As such, corn is a good way of filling up your rows to unlock these victory points for the rows at the end of the game. However, you need to be careful. If you get in a situation like this and you gain corn, there is no incomplete row to put it in, and so you have to start a new row with corn. This row is now specifically a row of corn. You can't put anything else into it, and anytime you gain corn until that row is complete, it must go into filling up that row. So even if you started a row with another type of goods, you could not use corn as wild to fill up that row until you've filled your corn row. As such, it's very much to your advantage to time your acquisition of corn so you don't have to make a full row of corn. And that covers all of the basic actions available in the game. There are some other actions and bonuses available on extensions. Many of them are fairly straightforward, allowing you to exchange resources or money for goods in the same way as the basic actions. There are some others that give you some extra flexibility on your planning or drawing phases during the game. You can find full explanations of these on pages 12 or 13 of your rulebook. It's important to note that the action spaces on your player board relate only to the actions on your player board, and likewise the action space on the extension is associated specifically with the action on that extension. This is true even if both of them relate to the same location. Therefore, this alpaca can be exchanged for wool, but could not be used as part of this action to gain food. And likewise, this alpaca cannot be exchanged for wool, but can be exchanged for food. If a player does not wish to take an action on his or her turn, then he or she passes. A player who has passed cannot come back in and take more actions on subsequent times around the table during the same round. Once all players have passed, the round is over and proceed to the end of round phase. In the end of round phase, The first player marker is handed one step clockwise around the table, and all players return any carts they've used from the right-hand column to the left-hand column. Then, on the extension board, slide down any extensions which weren't purchased to the cheaper end of the board, and then refill up to 5 extensions from the top of the deck. If you reach the end of the round and none of the extensions were purchased, simply discard the bottom one before sliding the rest down and refilling. The end of the game can be triggered in one of two ways. Either when, during the end of round reset phase, you cannot completely refill the extension market, or when any one of the 7 location tiles is completely empty. That means it has no resource tokens left, or it has no cards or carts. Once either of these conditions is met, finish the end of that round and then play one more complete round. Bear in mind that refilling the extension market is the last step of a round, so if this is the trigger, you'll play only the next round. Then proceed to end of game scoring. In final scoring, players will count up scores for all of the resources that they've collected and that they still possess at the end of the game. To do this, players should collect any tokens on their player board, out of their container, and out of their bag. Sort all of these resources out, but keep them separate from the warehouse and any orders. Firstly, you'll score points for all of the resources in your circulating collection and in your warehouse. You do not score these points for resources on orders, because you don't own these anymore. You've delivered them to someone else. The points for each resource are listed on this strip that you can give to players at the start of the game. Food, alpacas, and fish are all worth no points. Stone, wood, and cocoa are worth 1 point each, and so in this case the player has 4 plus 3 plus 2 is 9 points for those resources. Ore and wool are worth 2 points each, and so this player has 4 points for ore and 6 points for wool. Cloth and silver are worth 3 points each, so the player has 9 points for silver and 12 for cloth. Glass is worth 4 points per token, but the player does not have any glass, remembering that the one on the order does not count. Players score 2 points for each canoe during the game, so the player has 4 points here in canoes. Then players score their house cards, so in addition to 4 points per card, for which the player here would get 8 points, the player gets 1 bonus point for each matching resource type. So here there's a bonus 4 points for the cloth and a bonus 2 points for the cocoa. Players score the points on any completed orders, so in this case 17. They'll score nothing for an incomplete order, but they won't suffer any additional penalty for failing to complete it. Finally, players score points for any rows in their warehouse that are completely filled. So the sum of these 5 completed rows is 22 points. This bottom row for mission cards is an optional extra you can play with, and I'll come back to that in the next section. The player with the highest score wins. In the event of a tie, whoever has the most money left over wins, and if still tied, victory is shared. There are a lot of different resources in the game and a lot of ways you can chain it together. And so at this point I'll give you a couple of tips into what to expect from the different resources. The first thing you'll notice is that resources that are worth a lot of victory points are not very useful for performing actions, and vice versa. So food is used in a lot of these actions, as well as getting extra movement points on your turns. And fish and alpacas have a lot of actions available, both on the main board and on extensions, allowing you to exchange for different goods. But they're not worth any victory points. Wood, stone, and cocoa are also moderately useful for gaining new actions, but are only worth 1 point each. The only action you can do with cloth or silver is to exchange them for money at the market, but they are worth a reasonable amount of victory points. And glass, worth the most points, has no action available that you can do with it whatsoever. Another key thing you'll find is that some of these better engine building resources are actually quite difficult to obtain. And in fact, There are no basic actions on the main board which will allow you to gain fish, alpacas, cocoa, or ore. Some players will start with one of these resources, but if you don't, the only ways to get them are to build a canoe that has the matching resource on it, or to buy an extension board which allows you to obtain it. As such, you will need to think ahead if you want to go down a strategy which starts with any of these 4 types of resources. Because the number of movements you can make in a round is limited, you will often try to group your actions together in a similar location. And in particular, if you can finish a round at one location and then start your round there with more actions next round, that's going to make things more efficient. The other thing to keep in mind is how valuable order cards can be to your final score. For example, the resources on this card would be worth 5 points in your possession, but 12 on an order. But keep in mind the downsides. You've only got 2 market spaces compared with 3 for warehousing, so you'll be getting tiles out of your circulation more slowly. And while you're getting more points here, if the resources that you're putting here are preventing you from filling up rows in your warehouse, then you could be losing warehouse row points. So everything comes with a balance in the game. The game comes with one mini expansion module called the Mission module. The Mission module adds a series of mid or end game objectives for players to target during their game. To set this up, deal each player 3 mission cards at random. The player looks at them, chooses the mission that he or she wishes to complete, keeps it, and then hands 1 card to his or her left and 1 to the right. The player will then receive 2 cards from opponents. The player looks at those, chooses 1 to keep, and discards the other. If the player completes these objectives during the game, then he or she flips the objective face up and will score its number of points at the end of the game. This will vary between 6 and 10.
And that's how to play Altiplano. We hope that you enjoyed the video and we hope that you enjoyed playing it.
If you'd like to see this game in action to get a flavour of how it flows, we have a 1-round playthrough video, and you can check that out by clicking on the link in the description below.
If you enjoyed this video, please let us know by hitting the like button. Write your questions, feedback, comments, whatever you want in the comment sections below. You can also join our Facebook group, Meeple University Community, to share your love of board games.
And finally, if you'd like to be among the first notified of what's new from Meeple University, please consider subscribing to our channel and click on the Meeple in the corner to do so, and then hit the bell for notifications.
Until next time!